Chapter 13. Stunned. Joy sat down, stunned, and stared into space. Ted came over and took the letter from her lifeless hands. She let it slide from her hand and did not seem to notice. Ted stood by her side, reading, not fully comprehending, and reading again. Although it was a simple letter, direct and straightforward, he had trouble putting it into context and kept reading it over and over again. Ted knew Joy's family, but they had never been close. There were certain parallels that he did not want to recognize, and so his attention was relatively blank and empty. He sat in an adjacent chair and just looked at Joy. Ted had never felt so completely helpless as he did now. He didn't know what to say, he didn't know what to do, and he had no idea about anything at all. He did feel a deep urge to do something, and he thought he should at least put his arm around Joy, but still he did nothing. He thought he may have even fallen asleep, for it was soon dark, and no lights had been turned on in the house, but he still did not move. Just then Joy let out a deep sigh, and Ted thought perhaps she's been holding her breath all this time. Small sobs began to soften the stillness in the room, and soon Joy was sobbing from deep inside, sobbing like she had never before in her life. She could see the man that had been her father, carrying a small child down into the basement, and the child was sobbing, saying, "No, no, please don't, not again, please, not again, I don't like it, I don't like it." The door to the basement closed, and all was dark. Chapter 14. Again. Joy and Ted seemed to sleepwalk through life. Ted went to work each morning to a job whose best function was that it kept him occupied all day, seeing clients and exploring insurance claims. The fact that the work was mainly technical evaluations and justification for damages to vehicles suited him well. He could never have dealt with aspects of personal injury. He was just not very good at assessing human dimensions. Joy managed to get a job at a local department store, demonstrating the qualities of some of the recently evolved cooking utensils. She did enjoy her knowledge of recipes and engaged well with women at the level of the kitchen. As long as the topic was about home baking and cooking and recipes, she was on relatively solid ground. She could easily put on a smile for her clients and was always ready to accede to their wishes and needs. And in this small town, she found a ready niche for relationships that could remain relatively superficial and technical. So life went on, and both she and Ted stayed busy with events external to the home. And in the evening they would relate the events of the day and felt relatively safe and insulated from anything emotional. However, in some way, Joy realized one day that she felt heavier, and that changes were happening in her body, and that she was tempted to go to the doctor. But certain dread set in, and so the thought was quickly banished. It was at least 3 months later that she realized she was definitely pregnant again. It was at this point that she became determined to deal with her situation with Dr. Gerard, but in a typically Joy manner, by avoiding him completely. In order to do this, she needed to drive to the next town where there was a woman doctor. She arrived in the town on schedule, having phoned in order to make the appointment, filled out the necessary forms, and was called in for her examination. Dr. Julia Smith welcomed Joy warmly and casually inquired why it was that she had driven to T-ville rather than visiting the local doctor in J-town. Joy had been practicing her answers all morning and told Dr. Smith that she felt uncomfortable with the doctor in J-town because of the baby that she had lost on the occasion of her first pregnancy. Dr. Smith looked at her knowingly and asked no further questions about this particular topic, but invited Joy to disrobe and put on an examination gown. She did so, Dr. Smith examined her briefly and then requested that she schedule a visit each month for the next 3 months so that she could follow the progress of Joy's pregnancy. Joy felt greatly relieved that everything went as smoothly as it did, and that Dr. Smith's questions did not go any deeper. She felt now she was on safe ground. Chapter 15. David. 5 months later, a healthy boy was born to Joy and Ted at the clinic in J-Town. Joy was firmly convinced that his name would be David. She was not sure why, but felt there may be something biblical about it, and that he would triumph over great odds. Notwithstanding her relief that the baby was strong and healthy, and that he had arrived with no complications. The day she and Ted took him home, she felt great relief. Something had ended for her. A sense of guilt was suddenly relaxed, and she looked forward to caring for this boy, and to seeing that he succeeded in life. A sense of fulfillment flooded her, and she and Ted both doted on the boy. Their life at home was very changed. They both had a focus now, and they felt like some new dimension had opened up in them. Joy was overly careful with her new baby, taking exceptionally good care of him. Always hovering in the background was the awareness that her first baby had died, and she would make very certain that she would do everything that David might live. A curious combination of love that he was here in their lives and fear that he might suddenly leave was juggled emotionally. And this eventually became a kind of tightrope that Joy found herself balancing on. He had opened up a connection. Something had become ignited in Joy like never before, while simultaneously a dread of losing David hovered overhead, relatively out of sight but always shimmeringly present. Sometimes the dread, like awaiting death, loomed forth with a power that was overwhelming, only to be suddenly driven away by a flash of love that leaped out of nowhere, lifting Joy to emotional heights that were unimaginable. Something was blossoming in Joy that had never before been fully alive. She was deeply moved by certain colors, soft and subtle shades like pastels, that she had never before paid attention to. Certain strains of music, especially the works of Mozart and Bach, became almost essential refrains in her life. Poetry and curious fairy tales that she would read to David when she put him to bed seemed to leap out at her. There was a softness and a sensibility growing in her, an awareness like no other she had ever known, a feeling of being mother, and of being woman, and of being special, opened up deep within her. Meanwhile, strangely, just the opposite was taking place within Ted. He was becoming more rigid. Strange rules were showing up in his thinking, ways that David was supposed to toe the line, to be predictable, to behave and be accountable, to explain himself whenever Ted demanded that he do so. Joy was so full of her new love that she hardly noticed these changes in Ted. And Ted didn't recognize them as changes, but as a certain solidification of who he was. A manliness that had somehow been lacking in him was now showing up. And a feeling that he would make a man out of David. That was his job, to show David what it was like to be a man. David's presence was drawing forth deep layers in both of his parents, layers that they had not previously known in their own experience. A new sense of purpose, of responsibility was making itself known to them, but Joy and Ted did not recognize that there was an insidious dimension to it. Responsibility for this new layer in them was being placed fully on the shoulders of the infant David. Rather than assuming their new dimensions of maturing, they placed the burden of conformity squarely upon David's small shoulders. He, not they, was made to be responsible for its success. Chapter 16. Conforming. During his babyhood, David was fully unaware of the weight he was being asked to carry in order for his parents to feel adequate in life. Mother could only feel happy and feel safe if David reacted to her with promptings in a particular way. He grew into the stance, fully without recognizing what he was doing, that he was responsible for his mother's happy loving and freedom from threat and fear. And he quickly and naturally learned to dance with her in the dance of collusion. He could make her deeply happy by reacting to her in certain ways, and he could also help her move away from a certain almost unbearable sense of dread that would somehow creep into her from time to time, but only through insulating himself in a particular way from being fully aware of her own responsibility for herself and her own feeling of well-being. He learned to carry the weight of responsibility for her emotional contentment. David's relationship with Ted was of a different nature. Ted demanded from David certain sorts of action and appearance. Doing or appearing to do particular activities seemed to be overarchingly vital to Ted's contentment. The actions and ways that Ted saw David made no sense to David. They had no function in the reality in which David lived, other than to satisfy Ted, or to keep him from branching off into a peculiarly hurtful criticism of David. Ted's actions made no sense in David's experience of the world, and David experienced his father's requirements for him as being somehow disconnected from anything logical. And so David unknowingly shaped himself to conform to the needs of his parents first. His own needs took second place. Responsible. Following David's birth, his parents focused much more of their awareness on David than on each other. Curiously, this improved their marriage. They thus became less aware of one another, and David's existence gave them a topic of conversation that they had not had before. Now they could speak innocuously about David, and this helped them to avoid each other, especially when they were together. This may sound strange, but their avoidance of finding things to say about each other gave them a chance to fault each other less, and to find fault with David instead. But this did not stop their criticism of each other. Instead, they could attack each other in subtle ways by bringing up topics that focused on David, but that involved ways that David did not fulfill the requirements that each one held David responsible for. Mother, for example, found ways to talk about how much she loved the child and how he showed so little appreciation of her care. Father was always on about how inattentive David was, and how he would have to start recognizing how important parents were, and how he would eventually recognize the opportunities he had missed. In their own eyes, the parents were sure of what important parts they played in David's life. They were vital in David's life, but not in the ways that they thought. Mother was essential just in the warmth and caring that David felt from her. He loved being in her presence, and it did not involve her doing anything in particular. He just loved her as she was. This love was something that she had always longed for, and it was always something she had initially felt with Ted, until the strange distance had set in, and his curious preoccupation with his own focus. Ted had become aware of a sense of pride in himself, but it was dependent upon other people seeing him as a good father, and that in turn came from his view that what David did and how he acted were directly reflective of Ted's good parenting. But David experienced Ted as a model rather than as a director, and he strove to be like Ted. But a curious twist came into this desire, and that arose with Ted giving David directions in how to appear, rather than supporting him in an experience of his own being. David couldn't understand why his father was so focused on how other people saw him, rather than on just living out a certain joy of being. A joy of being that David definitely experienced deep within himself. In Father, this joy of being seemed to get swallowed up in a preoccupation with how he looked to others. These two people, his parents, were the principal relationships in David's life, as well as being his protectors and nurturers. But David had another relationship, one that neither of his parents took seriously, and that was Gordy, a close friend that lived only in David's imagination. And this was his saving grace. He found he could talk to Gordy about anything and everything, and that Gordy was always understanding and caring, and had insights that were beyond David, in fact beyond either of his parents. David was initially very open with his parents about his friendship with Gordy, and they enjoyed hearing about him. But as time went on, they seemed to evince a kind of suspicion about Gordy, and began looking strangely at David whenever he mentioned or spoke about things Gordy had told him. David was unaware that his parents had quietly discussed putting David in a mental hospital. They spoke about this only in whispers with each other, because mental hospitals were a source of disgrace for the family, and then they themselves would be viewed with suspicion by the community. So it was a great relief to them that a time arrived when David no longer mentioned Gordy, and his parents quietly said to each other that it was just a phase that was now over. David never realized what a close call he had had. He knew nothing of institutions or of organizations whose primary function was to justify their own existence, and who viewed their own inmates as property. But Gordy, in some way, knew the difficulties of leaving a structure that presumed full rights over one. Gordy had a deep memory that extended back eons into the past. And he also understood that most grown-ups thought that their own memories only contained things that they had learned or that had occurred since their birth. They knew nothing of the memories that aliveness itself carries. Chapter 18. The Sentence. What we think of as our life is really the birth canal, and it is also a time in which we must participate in the gathering. Joy awoke suddenly from her dream. It was so intense that her heart was pounding, and she could not seem to get enough air into her lungs. "My God, what was that?" she muttered. Shaking, she turned on the light and tried to talk to Ted, but he just murmured something and turned over in his sleep. She got out of bed and went into the kitchen, not really knowing what she was doing. Got some milk out of the refrigerator, then put it back, then turned on the tea kettle, but she didn't want tea, not at this hour, and finally just went into the living room and sat in her chair. She tried to recall the dream, but could not. Then she tried to recreate it, but this also left her just feeling and shaking, and then the final sentences loomed up again with an insistence that startled her. What we think of as our life is really the birth canal, and it is also a time in which we must participate in the gathering. What could that possibly mean? These few words had shaken her to her roots. The next morning, after a troubled sleep, she wanted to tell someone about her dream, but there was little content to it. There was really nothing to say about it, for she did not remember it, even though the results of having had it was still strong within her. And she was so emotionally shaken by it that she thought she might really be going crazy. It just didn't make any sense. Life as a birth canal? And gathering? What gathering? Gathering what? And how? And why? Life was difficult enough without strange thoughts like these rumbling around inside her and continuing to trouble her. It would be better if she told no one about this. Certainly not Ted. Ted was troubled enough about what other people thought of him. David sensed that something was troubling his mother, but by then he had learned not to ask too many questions about things that were obviously not being said. He felt her underlying agitation and did not want it aimed at him, so he kept silent. And Ted was his usual bland self. Ignoring had become his standard approach to the world. But the sentences would not leave Joy alone. What we think of as our life is really the birth canal, and it is also a time in which we must participate in the gathering. Chapter 19. The Dream. The dream puzzled Joy for many weeks, and she could make no sense of it, yet it had a grip on her that would not let go. That is, until a second dream appeared, unbidden and unexpected. This new dream puzzled her even more. She found herself in a deep dungeon, with walls made of stone and of ancient brick, and she wandered throughout it, searching for an exit. Although there was no source of illumination, wherever she went she was accompanied by a soft glow that seemed to emanate both from her own body and also from the walls of the dungeon. She had lived in this dungeon for so long that she knew no other place, and she somehow felt at home here, but at the same time she knew she must escape. Her wanderings continued endlessly, and whenever she thought she was making headway toward an exit, a new twist occurred, and aspects of the dungeon that were completely new would present themselves to her. The dream suddenly ended, and she awoke breathlessly. But as she tried to recapture the dream, for the feeling was intense, all she could recapture was a sentence that continued to play and replay in her awareness. I will continue to plunge you into new situations so that you can learn from them. Even though you may feel lost, this is all part of your path. The sentence resounded over and over again in her awareness. She told no one about her dream, but her own question made itself known in response. How can I learn from a situation that I have never been in before? Chapter 20. The Unknown. The impact of these two dreams accompanied Joy daily, even when she was not thinking of them, even when she could not remember the statements that had affected her so deeply. She felt something deep within her belly that had been put there by the dreams. This feeling persisted independent from memory, like a seed growing relentlessly. Fed by everything that occurred, it announced its presence. It was very different from the experience of being present with David. This new seed was a force that propelled her forward rather than inward, a draw, a magnet with a pull toward a place both within herself but also larger than herself. It both terrified Joy but also was a secret source of pleasure and promise. It felt on the one hand like a secret mission that she alone knew about. On the other hand, it boded mystery and the unknown, both things that she had learned to dread. And for the first time since she could remember, a thrill ran through her body. She was an explorer into a realm deep and personal, walking an edge like a child balancing on a wall, or climbing a high tree forbidden by her parents. The unknown she was invited to explore was herself. Chapter 21. The Edge. What Joy did not know was that she had always stood on the edge of the unknown, and that she had always walked that edge, although unknowingly. Every living being is always on the edge of the unknown, and especially women. We humans learn to cushion that edge with our knowing. Oh, not all of our knowing, but the knowing that we've invented called language, conceptualization, ideation. You see, we narrow the world by making it tiny, by reducing our experiences into their smallest components, and then thinking that those components are the reality itself, rather than the workings of our intellect. We become fixated on the workings of a small part of our mind at the loss of the larger picture. And from that tiny place, we justify our destruction of the rest of reality. From the earliest times of aliveness, we have been focused on survival. And in order to survive, we need to learn the plan that our surroundings held. If we knew the plan, we could avoid capture. If we knew the plan, we could find the energies needed for our perpetuation. And the continuation of aliveness was our initial goal. But once aliveness learned how to turn experiences into concepts, then the plan became complex and involved, and one way of surviving was to ignore the fact that we were reducing our surroundings to a system of complex and interactive ideas. And the ideas began to compete for their own survival. And once that took root, then ideas became more important than aliveness itself. And ideas fought each other for dominance and control. But competing ideas then discovered a means of survival by going underground, allowing themselves to be ignored, to be treated as if they did not exist, and to await the chance for their sudden eruption. But these were things Joy would only learn much later in her life. Chapter 22, The Channel. The dreams receded, but the feelings they had given rise to did not. Joy felt herself involved with a new level of feeling, a layer that was subtle and also profoundly powerful. And she began to look at David in a new way. She strangely felt that he was responsible for these new feelings that were so omnipresent in her, and that his own aliveness was a mystery that was not answered by learning about conception and cell division, biology and chemistry, nerve impulses and brain structure. She sensed an element in him that was pure mystery, and which involved realms of being that could never be understood, but that required one somehow to plunge unknowing into them and to live them out. A deep curiosity arose in her, not only about David, but about all life. And one of the most curious thoughts was that she was the channel for life itself. But where had it begun? And what was it exactly? And was there no name for it, no words, no concepts, yet a feeling that would not let go of her? And her dreams continued. Chapter 23, The Garden. The next dream disturbed Joy to the core. She was in a great edifice made of some synthetic material. Its form was pyramidal, and it extended to a great height with sloping sides and a peaked roof. She lived inside this pyramid and was relatively content, except for the lack of nature. She yearned for something natural, a tree, or grasses, or a blossom of some sort. Her yearning seemed endless, bottomless, and yet it didn't make any sense. There was no logic to it, for within this great pyramid of a structure, she had everything she could seemingly want. But the yearning grew and grew until it was unbearable, and in a great shriek she said a word that was unthinkable. With that, the great edifice suddenly crashed to the ground in a great cloud of dust, and she was left without a roof, without walls, without protection. She felt completely vulnerable to the elements, and began to regret the word she had spoken. She wanted to take it back, but could not retrieve it, for she couldn't even remember what the word was. And besides, how do you take a word back anyway? You can't swallow it, or reverse it, or inhale it. The word had been said, and was not to be undone. In a great shudder of grief, Joy began to look around and to take stock of the destruction around her, and of the fact that she was now open to the elements. At first a soft rain began to fall, so gently that it seemed at first like a fine fog, or a mist, but it landed without a sound, and as it did so, the dust around her settled, and she could begin to see clearly again. She was surprised to see there was no rubble. How could such a great structure fall to earth without there being some remaining rubble? But there was none. There was only clarity around her. The second thing that she sensed was a fine, fine scent, as of something green, something growing, something extending itself gently up out of the earth. She couldn't believe how fine and soft and subtle this was. She could almost see it move as it grew, but then she thought to herself that she was only imagining it, that she was creating a fantasy out of the grief of what she had destroyed. But when she closed her eyes, the scent was more tangible than ever. There was a freshness to it, and a newness, and the smell of something pure and good and necessary. When she opened her eyes again, she saw fine blossoms and more substantial shoots, and the beginning of a tree trunk with fine branches, and she reached out and touched it, and felt a shudder run from her fingers throughout the rest of her body, as if something was also beginning to grow inside herself, something that recognized what was happening up out of the invisible debris. The next time she opened her eyes, she saw that she was in a magnificent garden, with colored blossoms all around and fine trees reaching upward, some with fruit hanging from branches, and a lovely silky grass growing between her toes. She then recognized that she was naked, and she felt fresh and renewed and deeply alive. She exhaled as if all the air she had ever breathed while she was in the pyramid was leaving her body, and then the inhalation of something cool and moist and deeply thrilling filled every cell of her being. She awoke feeling that she had shed something monstrous and false and dead and shallow, but she didn't know what it had been. She only knew that something new had taken over her life, and that she would never be the same again. This is the end of Book 4, Mother. Thank you for listening. I am the reader and the author, Steve Gallegos, and I invite you to continue on with Book 5, Father.